Hey, 2, hey, check. Two, hey, check this. One, two, hey, check.
I'm from Toronto, but Parliament.
Two, hey, check.
There's also another museum.
Okay.
There's a nature museum of
History, yes.
Right.
It's very
It's way
interesting.
across.
A lot of
Cool.
stuff down here.
Okay, yeah, right. I gotta be careful because I don't want my like silly. Really? Right. What's it gonna be?
But it's been a while, so
Right. It'll be fine. That area is fine. Yeah. Well, I mean, pay for bits of the business. So you got a lot of.
I think it's more so the idea that
So I have a friend back home who tattoos for a while. He said the thing to do is have sugar. Yeah, he said drink a Coke before you go. Apparently it's something to do with the pain. Like, yeah. I can't tell you whether or not it works because I just always did it, so I haven't had a bad tattoo. But apparently that's a thing. Yeah. Because your body gets exhausted, like because it has this like all these responses to the pain, so it doesn't get weird. What did you want to do with that? Right. Okay. Gotta do it. This is your own good. If you do this, you'll thank me.
yeah.
Right. Right. Lose your mind. You get it out. Okay. Oh, that's good. Really? It's big.
I'm going second. I'm going first. I know we're messing you up. We're probably gonna either go here or
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2. I'm going to get us started with a few housekeeping announcements before we start our opening panel. I'm going to adjust this mic. So I hope everyone had a good rest last night. You're feeling revived and excited. The sun might even come out. Or maybe not. Look at that. Rain pours down. Never mind. No sun. Don't expect that. A few housekeeping items I wanted to point out for you. Today, the youth stream is happening in a different room. We do have signs up. It's up on the 7th floor. It's unfortunate. We thought we'd have that room all 3 days, but we don't. We will have that room again tomorrow. But just for today, any of the youth stream workshops will be happening in 7035, and follow the signs, except for the final session of the day, which is a consultation with the homelessness partnering strategy of the federal government. It's going to be a fabulous session co-facilitated by young people to give feedback to the federal government about how to better engage young people in the process. So that is happening in this room, 4007, from 2:45 to 4 o'clock. Those things are noted in the insert in your program. So if you forget, just check that out, ask volunteers. I wanted to let people know also we've moved around the winter clothing bank and the art show. We decided we would just put them all in the memorial room since it's a big room and lots of people have been using it. So now it's become sort of the arts memorial clothing headquarters. So it's right down the hall. So that's a place you can go if you want to contribute to the memorial. People have been making beautiful flags in memory of young people who have died, which we're posting up on the windows. And you can also pick up some clothing items if you need them, winter clothing items. And we'll also have the art up in that room. So it'll be a one-stop shop. You can stop in and please take a look at the artwork. If you're interested in any piece, you could buy it. The proceeds go back to the artist. The art show, my notes are not very organized, so today the breakout rooms are going to be, so after this session is done, when you're going to the simultaneous sessions, several of our breakout rooms, if you've looked at the program, you'll notice are in the Vanier building, which is the building behind us. It's actually connected, and there are lots of signs, and there's going to be lots of volunteers to help direct you. So just wanted to give you the heads up on that, to prepare for that. Different rooms today. And I wanted to also remind people when you're doing a session, whether it's in here in any of the rooms, to please be conscious of using the microphone. For anyone who has hearing impairment, it's going to be really difficult to hear if you're not using the microphone. And I know some people feel self-conscious about the mic, but it's really helpful for folks who, if they're wearing a hearing aid or have hearing impairment, if you use the microphone. And last but not least, I'm going to call up Ruth, who's going to help us talk about how to better deal with our garbage. If you remember yesterday, I was lamenting the fact we hadn't done a very good job with our food waste and our garbage waste from lunch. So we've done some work to try and resolve that. We heard from the staff, the cleaning staff, that they would appreciate it if rather than piling up our garbage into the bins, because the bins are quite small, that we'll have the boxes and any plastic bottles on top, and just leave them out. And then we also have, there's compost, so for food that you've started eating, and didn't finish, food waste, there are compost bins that are laid out as part of U of O, and you can add your compost there. And I'm gonna have Ruth come up and talk about another thing that we have planned about dealing with extra food.
Good morning, everyone. So I did some research about carbon footprints in conferences last night. And then I realized that I have a lot of experience with conferences, and so I don't need stats. I just need bins and your help. So I'm really excited to turn our individual efforts into collective action today and tomorrow. And I don't know if anyone noticed, but yesterday when we had surplus lunch boxes, we took those over to the Ottawa Mission as a donation. And what I'd love to do today is take any excess snacks that you have, so yogurts or the fruit that was in your box. And if you're not going to eat it, that's cool, but put it in one of our blue bins. And I'd like to leave it out so that people can take them throughout the day if you're feeling a little hungry and you want a snack. And at the end of the day, we'll take all of that over to the mission as well, and we'll make a donation. So let's just cut our waste and work together, okay?
And that was all Ruth's initiative, and she went and bought the bins, so really grateful for our amazing volunteers, and Ruth in particular this morning. We realized that it was a long afternoon without any food, so now there's going to be that option, and we've also asked the caterer to bring in some snacks in the afternoon, so there will be a little bit of food in the afternoon instead of the sort of 4 hours of coffee, which is not good for anyone. Okay. I think that's all my announcements. Now I'm very pleased to introduce John Sylvestre, who's walking away. No. Okay. Look at me for a minute. Nope, John's back. Okay, John is going to moderate the opening panel, and please join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Thank you, Jackie. My name is John Sylvester, and I'm the Vice Dean of Research here in the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Ottawa. On behalf of the faculty and university, I want to welcome you all to our campus today. I think also, before I begin, I also just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge Jackie and her huge team of volunteers and the staff at the Center for Research and Educational and Community Services for all their efforts to bring us together to discuss this topic. And I know it's a huge sacrifice of time and effort on your part to have organized this for us. So I just want to publicly thank you for all your efforts, Jackie. All right, we have another stellar plenary panel this morning. The topic is constructing and deconstructing youth homelessness. I'll be inviting our panelists each to come up and to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. I'll have more fulsome introductions in a bit, but just to identify our speakers are Cheyenne Ratnam, Larissa Silver, Tiffany Rose, and David Ferrugia. So the topic this morning is constructing and deconstructing youth homelessness. In this plenary panel, invited speakers will discuss the construction of youth homelessness and its implications. Rather than being understood as the result of systemic patterns of inequality, homelessness is often viewed as an individual circumstance. People experiencing homelessness are then perceived as indolent, immoral, and inferior. These presumptions can have profound effect on how people feel about themselves, how other people feel about homeless youth, and how youth feel about themselves. Based on their research and experience, panelists will discuss the constellations of meaning that contribute to the image of a homeless young person and share how to challenge myths about homelessness and improve young people's sense of self-worth. Our first speaker this morning is Cheyenne Ratnam. Cheyenne is the project coordinator for Away Home Toronto, City of Toronto, and cross-sectoral community collaborative working with young people as key partners, stakeholders and decision makers regarding the formation of a cross-sectoral youth homelessness strategy for Toronto, in addition to an implementation and sustainability plan. Previously, Cheyenne was the founder and co-manager of Project What's the Map, mobilizing young people with lived experience of homelessness from the global south to nurture a more coordinated system through multi-government policy circles and cross-sectoral community engagement. Some topics she has lived experience in both professional and is highly passionate about include youth hopelessness, youth from care, educational outcomes of vulnerable populations, childhood sexual abuse, youth development, mobilization, engagement, and human rights issues. Cheyenne has a bachelor's and master's degree in social work, and in 2016 was the recipient of one of 4 highest accolades presented to York University alumni, the Bryden One to Watch Alumni Award. So, please, Cheyenne.
I'm a very short person, so and technology is not my friend, and this is not even technology. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing this morning? Is everyone awake? This is a very dead crowd. Like, is everyone awake? Okay, cool. So as my bio stated, I do have professional experience, but I also have lived experience. And I started experiencing homelessness at the age of 14. I was on that homeless spectrum. When we think about homelessness, a lot of the times when we think about the terminology, the label, we think about explicit street involvement. However, homelessness is definitely a spectrum, and that could be couch surfing. It could also be having a roof over your head and not having enough money for rent versus transportation, being able to go to school versus being an active citizen in the community. So it's a very massive spectrum that people need to kind of still wrap their head around. When I was thinking about what I wanted to say today, I was gonna wing it at first, and then this morning when I woke up, I actually typed a little bit on my phone. So I'm gonna read what I typed first, and then I'm gonna keep on going with my message. Okay. People don't expect your presence. People don't expect someone to be somewhere or be someone at and with potential when your lived expertise and life has seen more tragedy or adversity than others may experience in their lifetime. It is when the political landscape of your body and experiences make your existence and occupation of space a surprise, a beating of odds, in comparison to the lives of those who have not had the fortunate or unfortunate depth of adversity which you have become an expert about. As if success, whatever the subjective meaning is, cannot exist in a parallel or intertwined and interconnected messy labyrinth of a journey or process. Our lives and the way in which we understand the world is through comparison and various simple or rigid dichotomies. For example, black versus white, poor versus rich, right versus wrong. And unfortunately, this is reminiscent of how we tend to silo people who may have experiences that differ from what the dominant discourse of normal living looks like and is understood. So I think this is very important because, as a professional, I still have to navigate the professional world as a person with lived expertise myself. And oftentimes we tend to forget that as professionals, we have our own expertise, that we are not siloed into just being authoritative or professional or, the person who is helping the other person. Oftentimes, all of our lives are very complex, and we tend to forget that. I think for young people navigating the system, they are let down before they even enter the system because of the social constructions of what youth homelessness looks like. For example, terminology and the power of language is very important. And oftentimes the terminology and labels utilized to describe young people who are navigating the labyrinth that is the homelessness spectrum and system, we tend to use criminalized language. For example, runaway. Why do we use the word run? I just do not understand that. What are you running away from? What are you AWOLing from? AWOL is another criminalized terminology. What exactly are you AWOLing? Because the last time I checked, many of our young people navigating the system, navigating the streets and couches, are escaping. There's a very big difference between escaping and just running away or being rebellious. And perhaps it's very complex that it's everything mixed together. However, in reality, most of the time, for example, for myself, when I was 14 years old, I started to couch surf because, one, I didn't know what the system looked like. There was no information in schools. There's a lack of information in schools about what to do if you're experiencing a toxic environment at home. And so I started couch surfing with friends and other people. And so when I started experiencing that, and I was interacting with people, many of the times they'd be like, wow, you're running away. Like, what are you doing, partying? What is going on? And I was just like, no, I guess I'm running away from something, but I'm not a runaway. There's a big difference. I'm escaping. I'm escaping a toxic environment. I'm trying to be safe. And sometimes the conceptualization of safety within the system is very problematic. The conceptualization of needs within the system is very problematic. For example, what exactly is needs or the perception of needs from different perspectives? So for example, from the systemic perspective, needs would be, okay, so this person is experiencing homelessness. What should we offer them as a service? And when we think about services, it's usually interventive services. And I remember talking to a focus group when I was a part of Hidden in Our Midst Youth Homelessness Study out of CAMH. And I was speaking to a group of young women who were young parents who also had complexities within the homelessness spectrum. And they said to me, when we think about needs and recreation, we often get services that address certain things, but they don't treat us as human beings. As humans, as professionals, how many of you guys do self-care? Raise of hands. Now, keep your hands up if you think self-care is essential to your lives. Why is it that within the service system, we do not provide self-care opportunities for young people navigating this labyrinth? Because that is also a need. So before someone even goes into the system already tells them they're a criminal, that they are rebellion, that this is just the phase of youth. When in reality, the last time I also checked, young people who are facing adversity have more wisdom than the next 47-year-old standing next to them. Because age is nothing but an indicator. Capacity is an indicator. Capacity is built through experiences. Wisdom is built through experiences. And so I think for the system, we need to kind of wrap around our idea of what we think of young people who are facing homelessness, because they are the most resilient. And I use resiliency in a very grain of salt sort of way, because resiliency means that you're able to bounce back to the previous condition you were in. I would say that young people who are experiencing homelessness are very malleable. They are able to have fluidity. They are able to navigate within systems and across systems to address their needs. They have massive networks on the streets as well. They're very well connected. And so we have to really step away from that sympathy perspective and from that savior complex perspective as professionals, because that's very problematic. And I think in the work that I do, when I speak to people, I come from a place of vulnerability. And as professionals, I think one of the downfalls of professionalism is the fact that we prevent our workers and ourselves from coming from a place of vulnerability. Great work often starts from a place of vulnerability. Great work often starts from a place where, you're able to really be yourself and be authentic when interacting with the next person, not a client, not a service user, but the next human being in front of you. And sometimes as professionals, we tend to blur this idea that, or not blur, but we tend to make rigid this idea that, I am a professional, therefore I need to be robotic. Great work has never been done in a robotic space. Never has been done in a robotic space. Great work has been done in a fluid space where exchange is alive and well. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be learning from young people because they are the experts of their lives. And later on tomorrow, when we are running a concurrent session, I'll be talking more about that. However, in my practice, I don't utilize the word youth. It's very problematic, extremely problematic. Even though the terminology is normalized within the system, it doesn't make it right. Because at the end of the day, that is actually going against AOP framework, anti-oppressive practice framework. And so when I'm doing work with young people, I'll often use the word expert because they are experts. We are experts as well from a different perspective. However, even going through that, we often silo people as like client, service user, worker, policy analyst, and we forget that service users, experts, are also professionals. They also have academic experience, just like you do. And so when you're interacting with young people, even before they come into the spectrum or whatever that looks like, make sure that you actually utilize that humility perspective and framework to get to know people and to not just silo them just as people who are in need of assistance, but as people who are capable and have potential or at potential. They are at potential to be educated, to have education, to be professionalized, to have professional experiences. And so I think the last thing that I want to say is that, as a person who has the professional experience, but also the expertise of lived experience, I think that it's very important to note that we are all complex beings. And it's so important to take note that, as a person who has lived experience, I have my academic background. I have my professional background. So do not work with young people as if the only thing that they could offer is their lived expertise, because they go beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so our second panelist is Larissa Silver, who is the Director of Community Services at the Youth Service Bureau of Ottawa. Larissa is an experienced leader in the nonprofit sector with over a decade of senior management experience. As the Director of Community Services at the Youth Services Bureau of Ottawa, Larissa has focused her department's programs for homeless and at-risk youth on the Housing First for Youth principles. YSB Community Services includes 2 shelters, transitional housing units, 3 long-term apartment buildings, and a drop-in center downtown, all serving youth 14 to 24. Thanks to capital funding from the City of Ottawa YSB, the City of Ottawa, YSB is building another 39-unit apartment building with a service hub along Riverside Drive. Prior to YSB, Larissa was the Director of Programs and Services at Western Ottawa Community Resource Center, where she provided leadership across several programs, including a 25-bed shelter for women and their children fleeing violence. Counseling services, you did, yes. Services for seniors and services for children and youth. She's Executive Director at Volunteer Ottawa right after moving to Ottawa from Calgary via Toronto. Her educational background includes women's studies, sociology, and public administration and evaluation. There's more. There's not. There's not more, but if you ever want to learn more than you ever need to know about Larissa, follow her on Twitter. It's all there. Larissa Silver.
Okay. Thanks, Israel. Israel is the tech person in this room, and he is super amazing. So thank you so much for all of your support. The unsung heroes of these sorts of things, right? Okay, so I'm Larissa. I'm the Director of Community Services at YSB, which you might have picked up in that 40-minute introduction. And so when I was thinking about what to talk about around the construction and deconstruction of youth homelessness, and there's so many angles, there's so many ways that we can approach this. And I chatted with some of my colleagues and some of the young people we work with, and one of the things that can happen is that when you've been working with young people for a number of years, or if you yourself are a peer supporter or somebody with lived expertise and you're continuing to work with other young people who are experiencing homelessness or taking advantage of downtown services, we can have a tendency to start making assumptions about the young people that we're working with. And those assumptions don't have to be negative. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that we get entrenched in stereotypes or mythology, but more that we can sometimes make assumptions around, well, most of the youth we serve identify as, or the youth that we serve tell us that. And all of that can be true. But after a few years, is it still as true as we thought it was back when we started to kind of entrench in the way that we were thinking? And so I think what we decided to do a couple of years ago at YSB, and what I invite us all to do today and throughout the rest of this conference, is not to doubt our expertise, but more to acknowledge that there are times where testing the assumptions of our expertise can help us then make sure that what we're doing is still in line with what youth are asking for, feeling that they need today. So that's sort of what I'm going to talk about now. So testing our assumptions. How do we assume we know what we know? And there are a number of ways that we can check our assumptions, and many of us who work in direct service, we may not be researchers ourselves, and we may not necessarily have some funding to bring research in, but many of us at least have experience with surveys, have some idea about where we can get information. And so one of the first things we do, and all of us have a database of some description, we're all keeping some sort of data. So we can go back, take a look overall, roll it up, what is it telling us? What inevitably it will tell us is some basic demographic information and all the things that we don't ask and that we don't know, and how come we're not filling it out, and oh my God, this is not that helpful. So, just acknowledging that. Some of you are like, no, our database is amazing. And so you can talk to me after and tell me how you did that. But it gives us a place to start, right? And what are our local, provincial, and national colleagues telling us? What are those trends that we're seeing? And are they reflected in what we think we know? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Will they be relevant down the road? Is it something that's really, really regional specific and we're probably not going to end up needing to think about it? Let's make sure that we understand that. I always enjoy, too, gathering our assumptions together and talking about them across programs, because I can't tell you how many times we've been in meetings and said things like, well, the youth who are coming to our services are experiencing X. And a colleague will be like, really? Because the youth that are coming to us are telling us Y. Neither is necessarily wrong, but both might be based on an assumption that we haven't really tested, right? So again, not saying that any of these things are wrong, not saying we need to doubt our expertise. Let's just make sure that we're checking. But I wonder, another great way to double check our assumptions is, crazy thought, let's ask youth. Let's have a little chat about what youth are needing, what they feel their experience is. And again, as we were saying earlier, listen to the experts in those experiences. But if we are going to talk to youth, let's do so in a systematic way. So at our drop-in, this is a picture of our YSB drop-in, and if any of you are staying at Nova Hotel or Les Suites, this might look familiar to you because it is literally across the street. So come on by and say hi. But one of the reasons why we did this is a couple of years ago is we were starting to reimagine our services in the context of a Housing First for Youth framework. We recognized that, again, we were starting to make assumptions around what we think that we know of the youth that were coming to us for service. And if we're going to start rethinking our services, let's really be clear on why are youth accessing our services and what is it that they're looking for. So this is why we decided we wanted to test what we thought we knew. Not necessarily because we thought we were wrong, but let's just make sure. So we put together a survey. The survey was developed by peer supporters along with staff. It was publicized by peer supporters and our drop-in staff. And what we did is we did a blitz for a month of all young people who came into our drop-in during that month. And when I say last spring, I'm recognizing that my sense of time is a construct and it's fluid. And so that was indeed last spring, but spring of 2016. So we're actually gearing up to do this again because we made this commitment to do it every couple of years. So just work with me on that. But what's awesome is we had 101 respondents. And if you've ever done surveys, you know it's very difficult to get a pretty high level of respondents. In a month, that's almost every single unique young person that walked through our door. And one of the things I can tell you without question why this was successful for us is because youth were leading it. So no question, again, that peer-to-peer element cannot be beat. So what are some of the things that we saw? And this was, it was a survey of, what did I say, 35 questions. We're not going to go through all 35, as fascinating as I know that might be for some of you. We can certainly talk more about that later. I'm going to hit some of the highlights. So how old are people? And no surprise, the majority of young people that were coming to us were between 19 and 21 years old, with a close second being 16 to 18. So again, aging out of those traditional youth services. What's the gender? We just under half identified as being male, just under half identified as being female, but a good 7% identified as gender neutral, and we want to pay attention to that too, right? So again, we don't want to reinforce assumptions. Sexual orientation. This is probably not going to be a surprise to anybody in the room that 43% of the young people who answered this question identified as LGBTQ+. But it's not a surprise, but it's always a surprise. And it always, always reminds me, every time I see it, how important that lens is to the work that we do and how overrepresented young people who identify on this spectrum are in the work that we do. I added the piece around how did you grow up in Ottawa because what the surprise was here for us is not that the majority of young people who come to us grew up here, but that those who didn't, only 3% of them are coming from the outskirts of Ottawa. And we talk a lot about young people in the outlying rural areas of Ottawa coming downtown to access services because services aren't available in the rural areas. I'm not saying that's not true, I think it is, but I think that the percentage of young people that were coming to us during that time, particularly in the summer where travel is more accessible from the outlying areas, it was less than we would have assumed. So we just sort of made a little note about that. 32%, and again, this shouldn't be a surprise, 32% of respondents identified as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. Again, a significant overrepresentation of young people relying on our services. And again, sadly not a surprise, but another reminder of the impacts of colonization for all of us and how we need to make sure, again, that we're providing or partnering in appropriately to provide those services. 30% of young people identified as being connected to a spiritual practice. And so this was worth paying attention to. This might be connected to a cultural identity. We didn't ask that question, so we don't know. But I think when we think about approaching services from a holistic perspective for all life elements of youth, a spiritual practice isn't something that would necessarily be an area we would automatically want to think about leaving space for. And so this was a good reminder that for 30% of the young people, this was an important element of their lives. Highest level of education completed. 63% of the young people who responded to this survey had completed high school. So again, we make assumptions around levels of education, where people had, that people haven't completed high school. And while that is the case, and I certainly in no way would not provide education services, it's again important to remember that we might make assumptions around what education level young people have, and that's not necessarily bearing itself out. While the majority of young people that were coming to our services lived on their own, a very close second were youth that were living with their parents. Many of us know that parents and kin are important links to explore with youth, and of course, just saying that they're living with their parents doesn't mean they're staying there substantively. It could be their mailing address and they're choosing to live in other places. But again, we can sometimes assume that young people who are seeing us are estranged from their families. And when we talk about reconnect, sometimes it's about, well, we have to recreate this connection. But what we saw with young people is that 76% said that they were already in relationships with their parents. Now, how healthy that relationship is, how secure that relationship is, that I can't answer. But 76% are telling us that they have a relationship with their families, and the second highest place that people are saying that they're living is with their families, so we can't ignore that. Well, we could, but we shouldn't. So of those who experienced homelessness, I just wanted to point out that just under 5% were currently homeless, but the majority who had experienced homelessness had experienced it 1 to 3 years ago, which sort of opened up another question. Are young people accessing our drop-in as a way to maintain housing stability, or are they accessing our drop-in because things are starting to become unstable, and it's what we need to pay attention to? So we don't know. We didn't ask that follow-up question, but now that we've shifted how we deliver our services and we're using housing stability as the lens through our engagement process, we're starting to find more and more young people that are living in unstable or unsecure environments. So I think the next time we're going to, as we come up on this spring, we're going to ask this question a little differently or probe a little bit differently. Interestingly, 79% of youth describe their physical health as fair to good, and 70% of youth describe their mental health as fair to good. But at the same time, 65% also said they had or suspected they had a mental health diagnosis, which reminds us that a diagnosis doesn't describe how youth are describing themselves or describe how they're feeling on that day. So again, a diagnosis can be really helpful, and youth might feel that they have a diagnosis, but that doesn't have to be who they are or how they experience their world. Almost half of the youth surveyed are using alcohol or drugs several times a week or daily. Again, is this the cause of homelessness, or is this a result of trying to survive in a very, very inhospitable world and system? I leave it to you. One of the questions we asked was why young people were accessing our drop-in. And yesterday, Megan LaPlante from Peterborough, who's here, was talking about her shelter, and that the two main reasons why young people wanted to stay connected to the shelter was food security and social inclusion. And what are we seeing here? The top two reasons young people are coming to our drop-in: food security. Almost right after that is social inclusion. So there's something there for us to pay attention to. And so what does all of this tell us? Well, overall, it told us that transitional aged youth who have aged out of the child and youth system are relying on our services, and that LGBTQ2S and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit youth are very overrepresented, that a mental health diagnosis doesn't reflect how youth describe their own mental health, and while many live alone, many are still report living with their parents, and most have relationships with their parents, and that homelessness experiences may have been in the past, although that asks more questions about current housing stability. Assumptions about high school dropout isn't always accurate, and that youth have spiritual lives that deserve space. Food access and social inclusion can be drivers for youth to continue to access services, and something for us to think about. So this survey didn't give us sort of pearl-clutching what moments, but it did remind us of the additional challenges that intersections of identity can have in already challenging environments. It gave us an opportunity ultimately to test the assumptions that we might have had and feel confident about how other sources of information, like the databases or the provincial or national research, fit into our services and reflect the youth that we're serving, and help support the peer supporter work moving forward as well. So again, this isn't static data. Our intention is to do this again this spring, but just to have a little look at, when we test our assumptions, the confidence that can give us in moving forward. Yay.
So thank you, Larissa. Our next panelist is Tiffany Rose, who is a youth committee advisor for Next Up. Tiffany Rose was born in London, Ontario, and moved to Ottawa in 2014 for a fresh start. She is passionate about making a difference in issues regarding homelessness, addiction, mental health, sex work, women's abuse, and child abuse, specifically shaken baby syndrome. Currently a community-based researcher, she has plans to work with youth and women on harm reduction and drug use in the future. Her work and passion is motivated by personal lived experiences. When Tiffany isn't working, you can find her watching Netflix with her partner. She loves the color purple, as well as Greek and Caribbean food, and considers coffee and chips her vices. Please welcome Tiffany.
came from. Okay, so I'm Tiffany. To add on to that, that's a bio from a while ago, a few years ago. So since then, I'm still been doing research, just with most with Jackie, and also with Making a Shift. I also work at the AIDS Committee of Ottawa as the Harm Reduction Coordinator. But today I'm going to talk to you sort of about my experience with homelessness, which is all just personal lived experience. So I was also on my own since I was 14. Then I got picked up by CAS, and they kept me till I was 18. Then I wasn't what they wanted me to be, so they dropped me off at my new home, which was the women's shelter in London. So I was left there with no family, no friends, no life skills, nothing, and 21 days to find a place. So what that did to me was it introduced me to some older people who introduced me to the drug world, and that started a whole new battle for me. Homelessness didn't seem like a problem anymore because now I was addicted to everything. So my youth homelessness, I was in London, and there wasn't really anything there for us. There was a shelter and a drop-in center, and that was about it. Everything else was all adult services, unless you got services through CAS. So my youth homelessness turned into adult homelessness, and habitually been homeless as current as well. I'm precariously housed right now. It just continually lives with me, stays with me. I've lived in a lot of cities. I don't know how to stay in one place. I don't know how to have a home. I don't know how to stay in a home. I was always, told that I should just go get a place. This was my fault. I can change my life if I wanted to. Things didn't have to be this way. But really, it wasn't my fault. I was left, by people who were supposed to care for me at a doorstep of a shelter. So, 10 minutes is a really long time to talk when you're standing up here. One thing is that nobody wakes up and decides that today I want to be homeless. It's just not something that happens. But unfortunately, it happens a lot. Since doing research in the city, I've been working with a lot of homeless youth, and it's rather sad. Actually, I met Jackie. Jackie was doing a presentation at a Alliance to End Homelessness conference a few years ago, and she was showing these really great videos that she did with the youth. And at the end of it, I asked, so what's changed? Over the last 10 years, what's really changed with youth homelessness? And a couple of the social workers in there were upset. But then after a couple minutes, Jackie was like, yeah, you're right. What has changed? Nothing's really changed. When I was a homeless youth, it was the same as it is right now for these homeless youth. We need to break this cycle and need to break it somewhere and somehow. I know, in an ideal world, I'd bring them all home with me, but I can't do that. But the youth that I have met are so smart and so motivated and so driven, and they're just, if they were just given a chance to be the person that they are, they would go so far. I was lucky and found Jackie, who sort of brought me into the other side of where I actually like myself, and I believe that I can do stuff, and I do stuff now because I know that, those are just these things that happened and that aren't just things that happen. These were experiences that gave me skills and education and motivated me to do other things. So yeah, I encourage people to just talk to homeless youth, whether it's your job or not. Even if you just see them on the street, just talk to them, because a lot of the time, nobody ever says anything positive to them. It's just, go home, go get a job, go do something. But a lot of the time, those things aren't options. Home is a scary place for a lot of people. You know, and sometimes just having that 2-minute conversation or buying them a coffee really changes the what happens for the rest of their day. So I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So our next panelist had the good sense to leave the warmth of Australia to join us in Ottawa in February, and I feel like we've cheated you because you missed the minus 15 degree weather we had last week, so you're not sad about that. But please, I'm happy to welcome David Ferrugia as a senior lecturer in sociology and Australian Research Council fellow at the University of Newcastle, Australia. His research expertise covers the sociology of youth, including youth homelessness, rural and regional youth, and young people and unemployment. He is the author of Youth Homelessness in Late Modernity, Reflexive Identities and Moral Worth, published by Springer in 2016. Please welcome David.
Hi. Okay, I have a really loud voice, so I'm going to put that kind of a bit far away. So how do I work this? Okay. Yep. Okay, sweet. Hi. So thank you so much to Jackie and the rest of the organising committee for inviting me to be here. I am from a very long way away, but I'm very happy to have the opportunity to come and talk to you all today. So basically, what I want to do today is I want to look at the field of homelessness research in a very particular way. So research is usually approached as something that's kind of outside or above the rest of the world, as something that's kind of conducted from this objective position that you have to be kind of a special person to get access to. And instead, what I want to do today is talk about research as a way of creating narratives or telling stories about society that is really importantly kind of connected to the broader social construction and deconstruction of homelessness. I want to look at research as something that doesn't just represent the world, as though the world was just there waiting to be represented, but actually something that has a hand in shaping society itself. Now, this might be kind of like a dangerous thing to do in this supposedly post-truth era where politicians feel licensed to just kind of make things up and call them objective facts. But nevertheless, I think it's really important to reflect on the role that homelessness research has in shaping what homelessness is in a very kind of real material sense. Because I think that what has happened in this research field is that homelessness has become an issue that can be discussed and intervened in outside of broader discussions of poverty and privilege that shape the entire world and that impact on everybody's lives in one way or another. And I think that this is a big problem and that it contributes to the production and reproduction of homelessness in a very real sense. So in addressing this theme, I want to kind of describe how I think that this came to be and suggest ways of responding. So something like homelessness has existed in capitalist societies for a really long time, although we've called it lots of different things. We've called it vagrancy, we've called it destitution. We used to throw people who were homeless or who just kind of, didn't fit into a whole range of social norms into workhouses where they did kind of menial labor until they died. But contemporary homelessness, as we think about it today, is really a part of what has been called the rediscovery of poverty in the 1970s and the 1980s. Now, of course, poverty has always been with us, but in the 70s and 80s, we saw a series of economic crises and a series of social policy responses to these crises, which had the effect of really deepening inequality and creating widespread social insecurity in affluent societies. And so poverty was, in this sense, rediscovered. In this context, as rough sleeping became increasingly visible in the urban centres of affluent societies, a diverse and growing research field emerged, which was focused on examining the specific social dynamics that surrounded homelessness. The emergence of this field has been absolutely critical to research and advocacy efforts designed to bring this issue to the attention of governments, and has also been an important resource in convincing governments to intervene in or to make some effort to ameliorate the issue of homelessness. Homelessness research has also been important in drawing attention to and acknowledging the specific issues faced by women who experience homelessness, the consequences of Indigenous land displacement, the significance of labour migration within and across national borders. So homelessness was not just out there waiting to be discovered. In fact, homelessness research contributed to making homelessness into a thing. Right? A thing that could be discussed and that became something politically significant. The emergence of homelessness research is also intertwined in the emergence of the services sector. And as the research literature has grown, so too has a large, diverse, and I think we can all agree, a woefully under-resourced services sector, which is designed to intervene in this problem. Policy interventions have also become increasingly diverse and specialised, and now include various kinds of housing organisations, youth and women's services, physical and mental health facilities, sexual health services, drug and alcohol treatment facilities, and so on. So, the emergence of homelessness research and the shape and organisation of the sector are intertwined. At the same time, homelessness has been heavily debated politically, and in fact, homelessness is the kind of issue that seems to demand explanation. It's the kind of thing where whenever it's raised, there is, the question sort of emerges, why does this thing exist? Why does homelessness exist? It's not something that can just be neutrally observed. It has to be explained in one way or another. And it's in the explanation of homelessness that I want to suggest is really critical to the way that homelessness is produced and constructed. A great anthropologist in the US called Teresa Gowan has looked at the way that homelessness is discussed politically, and she separates this into three kinds of talk: sin talk, sick talk, and system talk. Basically, in sin talk, people experience homelessness because they are bad, and the response is to punish them. In sick talk, people experience homelessness because they are sick, and the response is to treat them. In system talk, people experience homelessness because societies are, unequal, and the response is to change society. What is critical to all of these kinds of talks is the kind of person that homeless people are, right? This is a key issue that's at stake in homelessness, in political discussions about homelessness, and in homelessness research. And there's all sorts of constructions about what a homeless person is supposed to be. All of these are obviously inadequate. I'm not endorsing any of these, but it's a critical issue that is at stake here. I think it's fair to say that sin talk and sick talk have been much more politically prevalent than system talk. So, that's the political kind of debate. The academic debate, in many respects, mirrors this political debate, even though there is this idea that academic research somehow floats above society. So, in academic research, the key issue that's at stake in understanding homelessness basically is the search for causes. Homelessness is the kind of thing that is caused in one way or another. This is the assumption. And there are basically two kinds of causes that are identified. These causes, by the way, are called lots of different things. If you're familiar with the literature, the language is usually around risk factors is the key one, but structural or individual determinants, causes, whatever. I think basically they all amount to the same thing. So there are two kinds of causes that get identified: individual and structural causes. So individual causes are things like physical and mental health issues, particular experiences of abuse, drug and alcohol use, and family structures. And then there are structural causes. Structural causes are usually brought in by academics who are accusing other academics of being too individualistic in the way that they approach homelessness. And in fact, these academic debates often look very much like political debates, where it's basically like, if you have a particular explanation for homelessness, then you are like politically bad or wrong in some way, and here's me showing that in fact homelessness is caused by this other thing. So sin talk by and large is not big in academic research. There are very few researchers who would suggest that homeless people are just bad. But nevertheless, this is one of the ways in which the research and services sector intersect, because when causes are identified, they become kind of like levers for intervention. So if we say homelessness is caused by X, then we design a service to intervene in X. And then the more X's we get, the more services we get. So homelessness is caused by whatever, like mental health issues, so we'll have a mental health service. So homelessness is caused by this other thing, so we'll have this other thing. And so that is how the service sector and the research field have kind of developed together. And there is an issue here, which is that basically in all of this research, homelessness is being talked about as though it was a technical glitch in an otherwise totally fine society. In many respects, homelessness research kind of resembles medical research, right? So we have like a cancer or some kind of illness. What is this cancer or some kind of illness caused by? Is it genetic? Is it environmental? Whatever. Once we've got the causes, then we get the cure. The person takes the right pill. The issue is gone. voila, right? But this is not how society works, right? So the issue here is that homelessness is being talked about as though it was a technical malfunction in an otherwise unproblematic and well-ordered society. So the idea here is that by and large our societies are fine, and that homelessness is kind of this anomalous or separate thing which can be intervened in without actually reflecting on what else is going on in society. So the problem here is that we end up with distinctions between the homeless and the mainstream, or homelessness and the norm, or whatever. And this is a big issue because it suggests that if we just have the right intervention into homelessness, or indeed usually into homeless individuals themselves, then we can cure homelessness as though it was some kind of illness. This resonates with a broader political culture of individualism in which the focal point for discussions of poverty tend to be people who are poor themselves. So understanding homelessness as a technical issue kind of connects with this, and in fact so does a broadly therapeutic approach to homelessness, in fact, because the notion that you can cure homelessness as though it was an illness that resided in homeless people is also a kind of reflection of this political culture of individualism. So by looking at homelessness as something that is caused, what we do is we separate homelessness from the rest of society. And this is the way in which the demand for explanation of homelessness has kind of emerged. This connects with broadly neoliberal or individualistic imaginings of the social norms of the social world, and as a result, a silent but extremely powerful mainstream norm is left unexamined. So, how do we respond to this? Well, my view is that rather than looking at homelessness from the perspective of the mainstream, we should look at the mainstream from the perspective of homelessness. And there are a few people who have tried to do this. So Teresa Gowan, who I mentioned earlier, has done a great study of homeless men in San Francisco who spend all of their time making money by recycling bottles. And basically what she argues is that these are men whose ways of working and ways of being in the world have become redundant as a result of the basic evacuation of working class manufacturing jobs from the United States. And what she finds in their recycling practices is the continuing presence of a working class masculine work ethic, but oriented towards new conditions of inequality and uncertainty. I have an Australian colleague called Juliet Watson who's recently published a great book looking at homeless young women and survival sex, and talking more broadly about young women's experiences of intimate relationships. And in her work shows that young women must often endure physical abuse at the hands of male partners in order to have their rather dubious protection from the violence and abuse that they would otherwise suffer while sleeping rough. And my own research has shown that young people who go through homelessness experience this in terms of individualized definitions of failure and success, which result in them blaming themselves for this experience often. But then often when the young people in my study left homelessness to make a home of their own, they told me that people who were still homeless were homeless because it was kind of their fault. So none of us are kind of immune from these experiences. So when we look at the rest of the world from the perspective of homelessness, what we should see is unemployment, precarious labour markets, systems of gendered violence, and definitions of failure and success that impact on everybody and that construct some as failures without value, even as they construct others as successful and valued members of society. So in this sense, I think we should be constructing homelessness and our responses to homelessness not in terms of a separate social problem, but rather as a critique of the systems of poverty and privilege that organise contemporary societies and that facilitate increases in poverty in conditions of relative affluence. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks, David, and thanks to each of you for your contributions. There you go. I think we're okay now. Yeah, thank you. So now we have time for questions. We have just over 15 minutes if anybody has a question. As people formulate your questions, I'm trying to think of a question I might ask our colleagues, myself. How about if we do, so part of the theme here is around constructing and deconstructing youth homelessness. And I suppose maybe we might ask you to consider sharing with us your thoughts on what are some sort of steps that we might each be able to take as we leave toward this project of reconstructing views of youth homelessness. It's a big question, I know, but it's off the top of my head. So anybody want to give that a shot?
Okay, I'll go
You got
first.
something to say. You say it. You speak your truth.
I always have something to say. I think it goes back to some of the stuff that I was talking about before, and talking about more about self-awareness as professionals, and being aware of your own biases and being aware of the way in which you understand the way you work with young people as well, and challenging what you think is correct, because there's no such thing as right and wrong, really, unless you're really oppressing somebody. And so I think it goes back to really coming from that place of humility and asking the right questions, and being open to answering the questions of those who you are working with as well. Because at the end of the day, it goes back to building rapport, and that's meaningful rapport, so that you could better work with this person who is coming to you for support and guidance. And when you come from a place of humility and come from a place where you are, employing humbleness, it's easier to build that relationship. And anything, if there's one thing that I know about the social services network and human resources network, is everything is built on relationships. And so if a relationship starts on the wrong foot, guess what? You're not going to do your job well. The person you're supposed to be assisting or guiding is not going to be able to address their needs well. Because if your relationship does not start well, then perhaps, oftentimes actually, the person is less likely to listen to what you have to say, or less likely to want to engage with you. So always come back to yourself and make sure that before you enter the room, you deal with what you're dealing with in your personal life, because you don't need to put that on another person. And you need to figure out ways in which you can really employ humility and really employ some vulnerability, make space for vulnerability as a professional.
Any other thoughts? No? A question from the floor?
There's a hand over
I like to talk too, like my colleagues always tell me. Okay, so I apologize I missed your introduction, but I saw the other ones. I'm going to make references to all three, and I have a question to ask in regards to that. So you spoke about things that didn't change. When you saw Jackie's conference, things didn't change. How are we going to go for that? What do we do with this, right? And that's what the conference is about, is to talk about stuff. And then you came up and talked about the approach, our posture is different. And your response to that was, well, I'm going to make a survey and see what the youth need, right? So as a counselor, whenever I see a youth, I have a posture where I'm working on helping that individual. I'm referring that individual to something. I'm helping him get a better chance. I'm helping him find a path that's going to help him out of his suffering. So how do you deal with that, knowing that it's not his or her or their fault? If I go correctly, it's the system that's the problem. The poverty is making this. It's not an individual reason, right? So as a frontline worker, how do we go about to work the individual cases of individual suffering when the problem isn't necessarily, the problem isn't the individual, but the system itself? So as community workers and or government agencies, we're stuck in two different levels of how to work it. So how do we separate that and make it go forward? Thank you.
Thank you.
I know it's a big question, I'm so sorry.
Dans la rue, right?
I'm Dave, I'm from Dans la rue in Montreal.
Yeah, just calling them out. They're so smart over there. So I'm going to take an initial crack at this, and then everybody else can add something that will be much more eloquent. I think that what you're talking about, or what I'm hearing out of what you're saying, is that constant tension we have between wanting to and needing to work and co-create a path with a young person on an individual level, and recognizing we're having to do that within a structure of funding boxes, of what services we have, you know, and I think that this is so it's attention, and I think that that's always there. I think too, for us at YSB, what we've tried to do is create a system that can be as flexible as possible within the realities of the boxes that we work in. So we have the services that we have. We're funded in a certain way to deliver certain things. How we do that can be as flexible as possibly can, but also focusing on what we're really good at, but having as many partnerships as we can with others that are experts in other areas, so that whatever door a young person walks in, ideally, we're able to support them in getting the services that they need or that they want, whether we're delivering them or not. So it's still, though, working within the system. And I think what really resonated for me with one of the things that you were saying is that we really do look at things from a system perspective and try to fill those gaps in the system, because we're that one-to-one piece all the time. I have this young person right here who needs my help, and how are we going to make that happen? And shifting that paradigm construct into, well, what's that assumption I'm making around what mainstream is anyway? And that ultimately, isn't that always the goal that we seem to have as well, you know, stability in housing and education and employment and all of those kinds of things, all of which can be important. But, you know, having that opportunity to kind of challenge at a macro level the assumptions that we're making that are really embedded within our program theory right from the start.
Any other thoughts from our panel?
David, I'm looking at you.
Right. So I have sorry, did you want to, okay. I know how to, what you were saying, think about what you're saying and write papers on what you were saying. How do we take that academic thinking and start putting it into policy?
Well, one of the great things about being an academic is that all you have to do is write about, you know, broadly speaking, I think this would be the best thing to do. And then when other people ignore you, you sort of complain that they're ignoring you. Okay, well, basically, my view fundamentally is that the best policies to address homelessness are actually not specific to homelessness. Okay, the best policies to address homelessness are policies that make housing affordable for everybody, education systems which are, you know, good at dealing with difference in a general sense, labour markets which aren't so insecure that if you call in sick for a shift, your boss can just sack you, and is that a word you use here, sack you? Yeah, okay. Your boss can just sack you, and you have no recourse. So yeah, I think that the best social policy interventions into homelessness are actually like society-wide interventions that aren't necessarily specific to homelessness itself. I mean, the phrase that I tried to use in my presentation was relationships of poverty and privilege, right? So the young people who are walking around right now doing really good in life and who are destined to be like wealthy and really sweet just in general are embedded in the same systems of social relationships as the young people who go through homelessness. And the same systems of social relationships are privileging some young people and making sure that other young people have a really shit time. So I think that the social policies that are best designed to intervene in homelessness are social policies that impact on society on a macro level in relation to the key structural things that shape young people's lives, such as labour markets, housing systems, education systems, family structures, and etc.
Actually, let me add on to that. I think sometimes we tend to quickly go from something that's academically written straight into policy, and there's a gap there. And I think the gap that I'm talking about is the engagement with young people with lived expertise. And I think that it's important to make sure that engagement happens at that level so that they're involved in the policy making and the policy deliverables on how it's being implemented on the ground as well, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are going to be affected by these policies. So for an example that I could give is Hidden in Our Midst from 2014 looked at homelessness among young people from the Global South. And after the report was done, it sat on a shelf. So that is why, I applied for funding and got 50 grand to run a project, and it was actually lived expertise led. And this group actually navigated within different policy circles on different levels of government, and they built momentum from the grassroots level and built it up. So it doesn't have to happen at the academic and policy level at the higher level. You should always try to bring it down so that you have some grassroots involvement, because the work becomes more meaningful. There's more push and pressure for policy analysts and the government to do something about things when things are happening on the ground. So don't forget about the engagement with experts, because at the end of the day, they are the experts of their lives. They are the experts of how the solution should look like, and you are there to support that.
Can I also say another thing, or is that okay? So yeah, one of the things I should also mention is that, I made that joke before about how academics get ignored and then they complain about it. But the thing is that actually people who do research but who are in the sector are way better, in my experience, at framing the outcomes of their research in ways that other people care about and want to connect with. Academics are like famously terrible at this. For a whole host of different reasons, right? Not necessarily our fault, although sometimes it is. So what I would suggest is that, like, a lot of the best and really critical homelessness research that I read and that actually gets some kind of public visibility, right, even if it doesn't result in social policy change, like it results in some kind of public debate, is conducted by organizations which create relationships between academics and people in the sector, and who then do, academically informed research, but that are able to frame the outcomes of that work in ways that are directly relevant to debates happening there and then, as opposed to academics who frame their work in relation to intellectual debates happening 30 years ago, right? So I suppose the best thing to do to change kind of those kinds of narratives is actually better relationships between academic researchers and researchers who are in the sector that are informed by the kinds of things I was talking about today.
Hi, so I really resonated with like all of what you said, and thank you for all of that, because like those are the four voices that goes in my head every day. But and just to add on to what you said about policy and things like that, I also think that it's not necessarily legislation that changes societal or community behavior. It's rather, I think government is more like a mirror of society, and because like one example would be, we had it's not labor laws happen, then unions happen. It's unions that put pressure to have more regulations around labor rights. But anyway, I just wanted to add to that. But my question is, so going back to the topic of language, so like when we categorize ourselves like as government and as individuals or service provider and things like that, I think when we do that, we kind of loses that we're human beings, like business owners, landlord, blah, 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 blah. And then we lose that humanity. So my question then is, when we categorize ourselves in such manner, do you think we lose our power and potential for influencing and participating in this democratic society that we live in? And because I say that because I find that we kind of misjudge the role of government instead of like waving a magic wand and it directs everything, but really in reality, everything kind of just work with each other and kind of do a dance, or it's kind of like a, but anyway, a bottom line question is, do you think we lose our power when we start talking about service provider, government, cities, me, blah, blah, blah? Thank you.
I think that labels and your professional label is included in this is negotiable. So I know for me in my practice, I elevate certain things about myself depending on who I'm engaging with. And I decrease other things when I'm engaging with those circles. And so depending on the person that I'm engaging with, I would perhaps elevate my professional credibility, minimize my lived expertise, so that that negotiation of power is a lot more equal between myself and the other person. Whereas if I'm engaging with a young person, for example, depending on their capacity and our relationship, how it's built, I might elevate my professionalism. Or I might talk more so about my lived expertise so that they could understand that I do really understand or try to understand what they're going through. And so I think that power and influence is very negotiable. Power is negotiated. And so you have to really think about how you want to play with those different hats that you wear, whether you want to wear hats at the same time, whether you want to silo those hats, and how you want to navigate through different circles, through the system, and figure out what works better for you, dependent on what you're elevating and what you're minimizing. I don't know if that answered your question.
Any other?
I think that society is a space in which people are constantly struggling to contest what is seen as legitimate, and I think that it's not unreasonable to point out that wealthy people have more access and political power, that men hit women, that bosses exploit their workers, and that these people exist, and they're not just labels, they're actually structural positions in society that facilitate the use of power and that create powerlessness. And it's really important to name those things and not just kind of pretend that we're all the same, because actually we're not actually all the same. Some people have heaps more power and authority and resources than others. And if that was not the case, then we would not have to have this discussion. So I think we should really kind of have that at the forefront of our minds at all times.
Thank you.
Hi. Is it Cheyenne?
Yes.
You were homeless when you were 14, and you were given 20-something days to find a place?
No, that's Tiffany.
That was you? Sorry. Well, my understanding is that there's a problem, because when people are given a time to find a place, if you're overwhelmed, you actually need somebody to go with you, and they don't do that. And the other thing is, if you don't have access to a computer or you're not computer literate, you can't find it on Kijiji, you can't find it on Craigslist. So your resources are very small. And I talked last night about the pet problem. If you have a pet and you cannot get on the public transit, and you cannot go in the restaurants to use the bathroom, and you cannot go into the community centers in order to shower or to meet people, you're really in a hard time. And so what you really need is actually somebody to do the research for you, say, here are 3 or 4 options. Which area would you like to live? Let's go together. And then I'll look with you. And then the person who's overwhelmed by all their other situations says, oh, thank you so much for helping me and taking me. And they get to decide. And it's not cut short. You go do it all by yourself, because it's like that social. Last night I heard that they were saying the biggest needs were food and social inclusion, but you're not feeling included when you're saying, go and do it by yourself, and especially when you're overwhelmed. I hope I make it.
Thoughts from the panel? We have probably time for one more question, if anybody has a question. Everybody wants coffee. So, convener, can we close early? We can do that? All right. I don't have the power. I have to go where the power source over here. No. So, thanks everyone for your contributions, Tiffany, Larissa, David, and Cheyenne. And I want to thank you all for your attentiveness and for your questions. And we will reconvene in our individual sessions at 10:30. Thank you.
It was great meeting you. It was nice to meet you.
just, I don't think we get the mics live. And, okay. No, I guess not. So we'll just, why don't we just introduce ourselves? Yeah, we can just introduce. Yeah, sure. Hey everyone, I guess we're gonna get started. And we're just sort of sorting out ourselves and technology and all the usual kind of stuff. We are just going to do a round of introductions of ourselves, the presenters, and then get kicked off with the presentation. So since I'm at the mic, I will start. So I'm Sean Kidd. I'm with the University of Toronto Department of Psychiatry and Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, and do work in mental health, psychiatric rehabilitation, interventions in psychosis, as well as youth homelessness. And yeah, pleasure to be here in rainy Ottawa for this talk. So.
Hi everyone, my name's Jeff Carabino. I'm a prof at Dalhousie in social work and international development studies. I direct a community clinic that's based around case management and counseling for those living in poverty, as well as one of the coordinators of an Out of the Cold emergency shelter as well in Halifax. And today we're going to be highlighting a book that we finished. It's been a project about 5 years of work amongst our group around notions of homeless youth issues, around stability post kind of street experiences. So we'll highlight those pieces. We're also very honored to have our whole team here today, so it's quite lovely. Jean.
Hi, I'm Jean Hughes, and I'm a professor in the School of Nursing at Dalhousie University, and so I work with marginalized populations, some of whom are homeless, but not all, and with a mental health focus. So my main area is the mental health focus, and I guess our team's been working together for quite a number of years. So what we're going to talk about today is a study that we did that was looking at, as Jeff said, how youth got off the street and became stably housed, and we followed them for a year. And we were in 2 sites. We were in Halifax and Toronto, and very interesting how similar a lot of our results were, very similar experiences. Okay.
Oh, it is? Okay, perfect. Hi, Tyler Frederick. I am a professor at UOIT in Oshawa, and like these guys, research area is around youth homelessness. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
What's that? Sure. Yeah, okay. All right, so I guess we'll get kicked off after much ado. So you've met the team. Some of our partners are on that slide over there in terms of organizations in Toronto and in Halifax that we worked quite closely with. Should also acknowledge our funder, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which funded this research. And so really what we're hoping to do is give you a bit of an overview of the project, trying to tease out, not just presenting findings, but trying to tease out some of the things that we found the most interesting, and as well share with you some thoughts about the implications, where we go forward from this after this study, which is wrapped up, and also hopefully at the end engage you all in a discussion about what this means as well in terms of developing practices, policies, and interventions. So Jeff, I think did you want to say a few words about backdrop?
It's kind of an interesting project because about 5 years ago, most of us have been working in the field for many years, doing a lot of research as well, and we had explored a lot kind of the etiology, the kind of entering street culture for a variety of different populations, and then kind of what goes on the streets as well. And that we kind of had worked as a team for about 5 years. And then we started to explore something that really no one else was kind of looking into at the time, which is kind of like pathways out of the streets. A lot of the organizations we're kind of very deeply connected with kept asking us, like, what happens after actually they leave? And that kind of spawned for us thinking of how we could actually frame a study with young people that could explore those trajectories out of the street. My last study looked at kind of the exiting processes across Canada. So there were some glimpses of some of the stages of getting off, but we never kind of explored longitudinally, like, what goes on once we don't see these young people? They don't return to a lot of the NGOs or formal structures that support them. So it kind of allowed us to think through, I think, a bit of a novel methodology and a longitudinal analysis that at least provides us with just a glimpse. This is more of a portrait. It's definitely not long enough to really capture the essence of their trajectories, but at least it gives us a little bit of kind of a narrative that we can play off of. And every time we've kind of we've shared this, a lot of the young people in the audiences have really spoken to us around, wow, that's actually my story as well in a lot of ways. So we're really touched that it's grounded in the data of these stories. What's I think also a little innovative or creative about our work is, so Sean and Jean are going to highlight kind of the substantive pieces, the kind of getting off the streets, the trajectories, the notions of fragility and stability, looking at supports, looking at notions of what housing and supports look like and are needed. And then we move away from that a little bit. Something that was really interesting to us, all of us have kind of done a lot of artwork with young people in our research, so we decided to capture some of these narratives through comic book as not only a knowledge mobilization strategy, but also as a way to kind of build a form of community and a way to engage young people in more than simply participants of a study. And then after that, we also started to realize, wow, there's some really interesting method pieces here. The ethics of doing this type of work never get written up this way. They're always kind of very standard, like this is our method, this is our analysis. But we kind of wanted to push a little bit the kind of messiness and complexity of doing this type of work with young people. What does it mean to do longitudinal work? There's such little out there. I mean, very few people are engaging in this style of work, but also no one's writing it up. So that's what we're going to highlight today. Substantive, method, and then knowledge mobilization as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And it proved to be pretty good timing in the sense that, and we'll talk a bit about some of the themes we found and what this study was about, but when it was wrapping up was right around the time the at-home Chez Soi Housing First study was finishing. And there are a lot of conversations now about transitions out of homelessness for younger people and for older people and what needs to happen there. And you know, particularly this dialogue you see coming out of At Home Chez Soi, where they had great housing outcomes for Housing First for youth and adults, but not a lot else. So something more is needed to help people make steps forward in other aspects of their lives, and I think our work sort of spoke to that. So the design, I'm going to give you the reference for the paper at the end, so that we're not going to go into a ton of detail on the methods. But we tried to use sort of essentially strength through triangulation, because with a complex topic that we don't know what all the variables are, we don't know what all the questions are, generally the best way to go is to have some quantitative metrics that make sense, as well as having in-depth conversations with people about their experiences. And we really saw, since this is a study about transitions, you really can't do this very well with a one-off interview. Getting those grand tour kinds of narratives, you really want to be on the road with people over time. And what you find is the first interview you hear a lot about a person's life, often the trajectory into homelessness, what happened on the streets. But as you meet with people over time, you get more of the day-to-day, month-to-month experiences, the experiences that might not be highlighted in a single interview, but you get a lot more richness and depth there. And that's what we did. We met with young people in Halifax and Toronto. We were fortunate to get this grant that brought us collectively together with two urban settings that are similar in some ways as urban settings, but also quite a lot different in size and scope and demographics. We engaged people 4 times over the course of a year. At the start of these studies, it's often guesswork, like why a year? We didn't know. It kind of fit with our grant timeline. A year kind of made sense. It's a nice round number. 4 times in a year is also a round. It's this kind of stuff you write into a grant, but that's kind of what we did at the front end. We've got kind of who we look to engage, 16 to 25, getting a little bit over that agency cutoff for many agencies of 24, and looking at 2 months to 2 years of some form of stability. We could be living back with mom, if that's perceived by all as being sort of stable situation. Could be in independent housing, supported housing. We weren't too interested in parsing out, a particular kind of housing, as long as it wasn't a crisis shelter or something that felt to everyone like something that could really come apart imminently. And at least 6 months of homelessness non-consecutive in their past. We looked at mental health and community integration, engagement and community resources as metrics there. We did in-depth interviews, as I mentioned, about the process of exiting. And the really great thing about this model is we got to know these young people we work with quite well, 4 times long interviews over the course of a year. And it was really cool as a research team. We kick around ideas, we speak to young people, we bring them back to them, and as they're exploring, we'd say, here's what we're hearing from some others, what do you think? So it was a chance to kind of do that grounded theory exploration. So some numbers here in terms of who we engaged. So 27 young men, 24 young women. We've got the mean age of 21. It was pretty much even split between Toronto and Halifax. We saw just over 50% identified in racialized and ethnic categories other than white. And we found, generally speaking, a lot of our findings, like you might be asking, what was the difference between Halifax and Toronto? We found what you often find around homelessness is homelessness as an experience with its trauma and discrimination, all those pieces is kind of leveling. You hear similar narratives whether you're in New York City and Vancouver and Halifax and Toronto. A lot of similarities, but we did see some differences, and Jean's going to speak to one area in particular. Because of one of the sites we're at in Halifax, we have a lot of young moms in Halifax trying to get their lives together to get back, re-engage their kids and get engaged with family. And we saw more diversity in Toronto, generally speaking. So what we found, and I'm going to defer to the paper into a lot of the details here, just to kind of give you the gestalt, is we found, generally speaking, that young people who were in independent housing, so not some kind of year or 2 year supported housing model, were struggling quite a bit more than young people who were in supported housing. And some young people did not like the idea of being in supported housing, wanted independent housing, but nonetheless, that's what we were seeing. And generally speaking, this really spoke to our experience of doing this research. This was really disheartening research in a lot of ways, right? Because these are young people who are the success stories. At the agencies, they put a tremendous effort forth in themselves, gathered their resources, were helped at strategic times by people working very hard to finally get some kind of stable scenario worked out. And in the year, about 1/4 of the young people we spent time with were back street homeless again in a year. And we saw that hope was declining. There's a fair bit here around, everyone engaged wanting this narrative of getting into housing, your life will start coming together, to all want that to happen. But I think what often happened, unfortunately, is once the young person found some housing, we're feeling isolated, starting to feel the full impacts of maybe needing to get caught up in school and trying to find work and all this. And a lot of that promise felt to many to be kind of unfulfilled. We saw community integration slightly declined. Quality of life and mental health kind of were bouncing around. So, the bottom line here is, generally speaking, it was by far the exception rather than the rule that this narrative of found housing and things start to come together, that hopeful kind of narrative, it was very few for whom that was actually happening. Those are the quantitative findings. And what Jeff mentioned as well, that a year was really not enough time. And at the front end of the study, we thought a year's a good amount of time to get a handle on what's going on. But these are long trajectories for most, like multi-year trajectories. So what we found was a year in some ways was like a wide snapshot of what was going on. It was better than a single interview, but a year, most were not going through an entire process of any kind in a year. So here we create 3 categories to try and understand what's going on, but fully recognizing that it's a dimension and that people are kind of cycling in and out of these categories kind of continuously. So the first group that we'll describe, who were a large number of the young people that we engage in Halifax and Toronto, we considered what you call marginally stable. So some kind of stable housing arrangement has come together, but they're really, really struggling. They're struggling with mental health challenges, struggling with engagement with justice systems, really feeling isolated, really having a hard time trying to manage moving away from street engagement and into trying to build some engagement outside of street cultures. But just generally speaking, not being able to make steps, make gains, and feeling stuck and feeling depressed often struggling with addictions. And really what was happening there was just the housing was not coming together. In fairly short order, things came apart and they would be back homeless again or in and out of housing or various marginal scenarios. I'll give you a second to read a qualitative description about what it was like, if you can see it. And you can kind of see in the narrative of this young man just really how he's struggling to even have a picture of what this transition would be like and putting himself in that picture. So the next group, again, this was probably the other large group amongst the young people that we engaged, we called stable but stuck. So they'd achieved some kind of basic stability. Housing wasn't looking like it was really going to fall apart soon. Generally speaking, they were making progress on some kind of really proximal transitional goals, sort of being able to look after themselves in the day-to-day, maybe with a bit of help, having some degree of a social network. But really, for this group, it was often education and employment as fundamental challenges, feeling like, okay, I've got this basic amount of stability, I've got perhaps benefits of some kind, but I'm not seeing a path forward in terms of actually being able to finish school, to get to college, to get a job, and just feeling like, and for many, it was this kind of, what was a depression, often again interlaced with trauma, of just feeling like kind of parked someplace and having a life unlived. So it was a real ambivalence for a lot of these young folks, because in some ways, it was a tremendous relief to get out of a lot of the adversity and challenge of actual homelessness, but then it was sort of stuck in this limbo where a step hadn't been made forward, and it was hard to see how that was going to happen, and just really feeling like just not knowing where it's going to go. So this was a second large group. The exception, and this was really kind of the smallest group of people, I'm using loose terms here because it really is, it's hard to sort of plonk these categories on something that's fairly dimensional, but I would say that certainly under 10 youth were in this stage, is where they were really starting to make some steps. So they had the basics covered, the housing was covered, starting to build a social network outside of homelessness. And really what was tipping the scale there was often education, starting to take some courses, starting to see themselves out there doing some part-time work, really beginning to have what had been in their lives quite a hopeless narrative to begin to be shaken up a little bit, beginning to see a path, to see themselves out in the world in a different way. And there was kind of a reciprocal process in a good way here, where getting out a bit more, seeing some tangible successes, changing that narrative about self to one about more self-efficacy, more hopefulness, and being able to that then gives energy and feeds into the effort to do more. And a dilemma that we saw here, I've mentioned the word trauma a bunch of times, but it needs mentioning in virtually every context, is what we saw here was this dance between having come through very traumatizing experiences pre and post homelessness, and trying to let go of aspects of that reaction to trauma to enable them to form different kinds of relationships, to develop trusting relationships with people where they can, where it's not like being homeless where you need to have your guard up constantly. So this balance of trying to let go of some things and grow in some ways. But really, it was a challenge space, and sadly, again, some of the young folks that we saw in this gaining momentum stage, we kept in touch with quite a number of these folks over several years afterwards. Took steps back again before re-engaging. So, again, kind of, if there's a general message here, is this is really kind of a more like a 5-year, I would say, path if we really wanted to capture where folks are going. And it's full of cycles. It is cycling into these various degrees of stability. And in terms of what we learned from this is we captured this set of experiences, or a few things. And this fits with some narratives that are happening in global development and mental health intervention around the need for complex interventions. This is not a mental health issue, this is not a housing issue, this is not an employment issue, and we tend, when building interventions, to just think in these single buckets. We do randomized trials of specific interventions like that, but what we saw where it was a very diverse group of young people with diverse needs across all of the dimensions and more that I mentioned, requiring different things at different times. Like, it sounds messy, right? Because it is. You really need kind of a menu of things that is ready, that has some evidence behind it that we know works, that's ready to be plugged in at the right time and place. We learned a lot about site of services. A lot of these folks that we spent time with, they didn't want to go back downtown to Covenant House, to go back to street-involved youth agencies, because they'd left that space, and it's triggering for many. They wanted to go to spaces that weren't there, and unfortunately in our system, there aren't really these transitional spaces like that. They're not very common. They wanted peer support, wanted a different kind of peer support, though, than they'd had typically. They didn't want a youth who felt like they were about 8 seconds ahead of them. They wanted guidance and advice from people who'd made a substantive step forward, and who could really speak to having made the transition and speak from lived experience from a really stable place. Social connection and hope, trying to work against that isolation and having that narrative about self that's more positive. and mental health supports and trauma. Again, coming back to that word, and this isn't, the need we perceived here in spending, and this was different. In past work, I've done surveys and talked with young people about mental health and suicidality and so on. Is really, as we spent this year with folks, really the depth and complexity just hit home. And we really saw that this isn't 12 sessions of a group, right? This is really a need for many, not all, like not everyone was experiencing PTSD or was severely depressed in that, but many were struggling in quite significant ways, and many really needed, from putting on my clinical psychologist hat, a fairly long term, along with, you can't make gains in mental health if you're struggling with employment or justice and all that, along with all those other pieces, fairly intensive engagement, psychotherapy, in complex trauma is very difficult to treat, and certainly is not a short-term proposition, but that kind of support at the same time. So there's the paper. I'm going to stop, and we'll have time for questions in that, but this was really intended just to give you kind of a 2,000-foot view of what this project was about before we do some deeper dives. And in this study and in the book that's going to be coming out this summer, you can kind of read a lot more about the details. So, all right, thanks, and I'm passing the torch to Tyler. You're next,
I
right?
think, is it me? Okay.
All right.
Sorry, we'll just wait for the presentation to get up there so I know what I'm talking about.
That's mine.
Can you find the one that says long way to go? Sorry, we might have told you the wrong order. Thanks. Perfect, thank you so much. So I am talking about our knowledge mobilization strategy for this project. In particular, a comic book that we, sort of a youth-created comic book that we did called The Long Way to Go. So just give you get a background. So Sean obviously gave sort of the higher level view of the project, but speaking to kind of our ideas about knowledge mobilization, we really knew we wanted to have a strong participatory element to the project, and we also knew that we wanted something slightly more innovative. Jeff sort of acknowledged this. All of us had sort of done previous work with the arts and are sort of interested in trying to tell stories a little bit differently. And so, from our experience with those kinds of projects, we sort of realized that these kinds of more innovative strategies are really helpful for making sure that your report doesn't kind of just end up in the sort of figurative or literal trash, right? We know that sometimes the kind of attention span for policymakers is kind of short around these things, right? And so having a participatory element and having a slightly more kind of innovative or eye-catching element is helpful for trying to connect along sort of a more kind of emotional level, right? To try to communicate some of the kind of humanity behind the work that we're doing, right? It can sometimes get a little bit lost in numbers and even qualitative quotes. It can kind of feel a little bit disconnected. And then also, we really sort of saw the value in participatory stuff as just a way to get better data to kind of, improve depth and validity, and to kind of hear the voices and insights of the young people that we're doing the work with. So that all sort of culminated in wanting to do this comic book. So just a little sort of, I'll speak a little bit to the process. So we recruited 3 participants. Just the way that the grant played out, we had a really sort of short time frame for this. And so what that meant is that we wanted to choose, we ended up choosing young people that we knew could kind of hit the ground running. And that we knew would sort of get along well together. But we also wanted to kind of get a sort of diverse experiences. So we got this great group of young people together. And then we enlisted the help of a comic artist that we knew through some previous work. Sean had worked with her in the past. And she just seemed like such a perfect fit for the project. She does a lot of her comics. She's had sort of long-standing comic series on psychiatric incarceration. So she has sort of a critical edge to her work. And, personally, she had some connection with homelessness as an issue and just seemed like a really good fit. So we paired with Sarah Finn on this project. And then so what we did is we sat down with this group. It was myself, Sarah Finn, and these 3 young people, and we discussed some of the main themes from the project, some of the findings we were hearing that we really wanted to kind of get their help communicating. And then so over the course of 5 meetings with them, we developed the characters, the plot, and wrote the dialogue for the comic. So just a few things about, one thing I forgot to mention is that we in no way intend this talk as sort of a how-to. We were sort of finding our way with this, and I know there's some people doing some pretty sophisticated art and knowledge mobilization stuff. So this is definitely, meant as a kind of a place to start dialogue rather than, hey, this is the perfect way to do it. We have a lot to learn. So take this in that spirit. So the idea is so a few things we learned. One is that we did really see the value of this as a knowledge mobilization tool. So we got a lot of positive feedback from service providers, young people themselves, policymakers. We did find that it did seem to have a bit of a broader reach. People have sort of continued to access it kind of beyond the project, and I think it was being read by young people, which is sometimes not something that happens with our research findings, right? They kind of go into the academic stream or the policy stream and then kind of disappear and don't necessarily get fed back into the folks who are involved. Yes, thanks, Sean. Sorry, I left them all the way at that end. So this is the comic. I should note that I don't think this is the very perfect version that we printed. As far as I can tell, it looks really good, but it was in a separate box in my office, so I think there's maybe some slight stuff going on there, but I don't think anything too noticeable, but I'll just make that as a small caveat. I'll note, too, that if you're interested in taking a closer look at the comic, it's available through the Homeless Hub. If you just search A Long Way to Go, it's there in a PDF format that you can download and print. And then we also found that the comic had a broader, we had a launch event for the comic, and we felt like the comic and the launch event, which had a lot of artistic components, had a lot of young people speaking, did sort of accomplish that goal of kind of humanizing the issue. And so we had some policymakers there at that event, and conversations with them sort of led us to sort of believe that they had been kind of impacted by this kind of more, this kind of different way of sharing the research. So what we learned in terms of the value of the project as a tool for community building, so even just sort of this 5 kind of meeting process, it was just really encouraging to see the young people that were involved created this really great supportive and safe environment. It was so cool to see them kind of sharing and telling these stories and telling these jokes about essentially this shared trauma. And they all had pretty different kind of experiences and trajectories, but we're connecting about a lot of the sort of shared things that were going on for them. And then, really through this group, you notice a lot of kind of honest self-disclosure and mutual support, which was really encouraging to see. And so we weren't framing it this way, but we sort of got us thinking that there's a lot of potential in projects like this to incorporate mental health supports, to make it, as a kind of frame it as an alternative to more kind of typical traditional mental health groups, right? Because these kind of got the young people in the room talking about their feelings, talking about their experiences in a way that I think can be sometimes challenging to do. Also want to highlight what we feel like we learned from the comic as an analytic tool. So that was really interesting as well. Through the process, the young people highlighted these kind of themes and this nuance that I think we would have overlooked otherwise. And certainly their participation was essential for getting the tone and the language right. I mean, any effort I made to try to write dialogue, I was quickly laughed out of the room. So this is going to be kind of pointless. I wasn't sort of anticipating such a large room. So you're not really going to be able to read this. But I'll sort of try to give you the high notes here. So this is sort of one of the first scenes in the comic, and the young person is sort of recently become homeless and is doing their intake interview at a shelter. And I mean, what I really liked about what they captured here is, this guy has this sort of tough exterior, and he, but then kind of underneath that kind of tough exterior, you can tell that he's really hurting and that he's really scared. And that was something that all of them kind of, they were all pretty seasoned street folks, and they sort of all connected with that kind of, that complex kind of emotional reality of it. And then the other part that I really liked that they pulled out of it was kind of the labeling processes that can happen within some of these helping services, often, of course, well-meaning and all that, but they were sort of not acknowledging that and kind of pushing back against that a little bit. So we have here this guy's kind of putting on this tough exterior because he's a bit freaked out, and he's getting kind of labeled here as needing anger management courses. And I think that was something that all had kind of resonated with them, is that kind of being misunderstood and being tracked. So this is kind of, a little bit further into the comic, but not too far. So this is our kind of protagonist. He's in the shelter system, and he kind of bumps into another guy there, and they get into a bit of a tussle, and then they kind of get to chatting. And so what I really liked about this is they sort of pulled out and kind of helped to illustrate some of the complexity around relationships on the street. And so, you can kind of capture the conflict that's often inherent in a lot of these relationships, but also this sort of, there is an element of support, right? At the end, they're kind of the guy sort of reaching out and giving him some advice. But then tinged in that support is also a bit of exploitation and a bit of manipulation, right? So the guy kind of asks for a cigarette and then ends up kind of grabbing two. And so, they were telling stories about these kinds of experiences for themselves, of being kind of manipulated and taking advantage of, and not really knowing who to trust. And this kind of complexity around relationships was really valuable because it was a theme that we saw in the research as well, and Sean sort of alluded to it, that these relationships can make the transition into housing difficult, right? Either your friends and your acquaintances are kind of pulling you back to that space, and so then it feels like you need to kind of just do a hard cut and just not include anybody because you don't want them to kind of screw up your new place that you've got by coming over and partying, so you just kind of completely wall yourself off, and then you end up, sort of no internet, no bed, sleeping on some, floor of some apartment all by yourself with nothing to do, which obviously is going to sort of feed into any mental health or addictions challenges you have. And so, and I thought they just sort of did a really nice job of capturing that complexity. And then this is the final scene I want to leave you with. So, sorry, this is kind of towards the end of the book, so a bit of a spoiler alert. So the young man here is kind of reconnected with his family. He hasn't moved back home or anything like that, but he's just gone over for dinner, a small step. And what I really liked about this scene is they kind of got to talking about how, this person reconnected, and we know that family reconnection can be a really valuable strategy for getting off the street. But what was sort of about it is it wasn't sort of tied up in this nice, neat, pretty bow where everyone sort of, oh my God, now I really get along wonderfully with my mom and everything's perfect with my stepdad and, life is just great. It's sort of what they captured with this scene is that his dad is still kind of not a nice guy. And so, but he's learning to kind of cope with it a little bit better. And I think part of that too, that I think they were all kind of resonating with was this maturity, right? That over time, the ones that were sort of most successful were kind of developing this maturity and these skills around managing some of this stuff, right? Their life doesn't sort of suddenly become simple because they have housing, but they're kind of developing the skills to better manage some of that complexity. So here he's just kind of like, my dad's a bit of a jerk, but I'm learning to block it out so it's not going to kind of derail everything. So just a few notes about the process. If this is something that all appeals to you, but again, I'll sort of caveat that there's a lot of sophisticated stuff going on. But these are just some thoughts to leave you with. One is that we wish we had some more time. 5 sessions just didn't end up feeling like enough. More time, I think, would have given us more time to sit with the data and kind of talk through the themes. We kind of rushed through it a little bit quicker than I would have liked. Also, there really needs to be a good balance between flexibility and structure, and I think this is where people with a strong kind of arts facilitation background come into the process. So I encourage you to make those connections if this is something you're at all interested in. And that's, being a bit of a rookie, I was sort of went in wanting to create this informal space, which I think really worked well. They all got, they got along. It was a lot of good conversation. But it meant that sometimes that conversation could just kind of dominate things, and we weren't necessarily getting the work done that we needed to do, and then people were enjoying themselves, but then we kind of get to the end of it and feel a little dissatisfied. So some of the feedback I got is that they really liked the opportunity to talk, but could have used a bit more structure to kind of get us through things. Also, I think there's sort of a sweet spot around the size of the group where you have to kind of be thoughtful and strategic about the size of the group. So our small, selected group worked well in a lot of ways. They were really nice to each other. We got sort of, we were able to hit the ground running. But one of the big kind of challenges with a smaller group was attendance. So there's lots of instability in their lives. So again, these were the superstars in a lot of ways, but there was still a lot going on for them. So it meant that some days, there's 3 of them, so 2 of them wouldn't show up, because of understandable stuff going on. And so, well, you can't really move forward. And so then you kind of, or maybe 1, 2 people show up, and then you kind of have to spend some time catching the other person up because you don't want to feel, them to feel cut out of the process. So some of that was complex, and so a larger group would mitigate some of that, right? If 2 people don't turn up, you can kind of move forward. But the challenge then with a larger group is you're going to lose some of, we were able to put together this shared vision, but with a larger group, you're going to have to put a lot more work into kind of getting everybody on the same page, establishing shared expectations and kind of group norms. I'm not sure one single project is going to work quite the same way. You might have to sort of break it into an anthology or something a little slightly different. And I'd also sort of note that this cherry picking that we did, has some kind of problems too, in that, you end up then just including certain kinds of voices. And so I think a larger group helps to kind of diversify that. And so one sort of thought that I would sort of suggestion or recommendation is to consider different types of engagement or different kinds of roles. So if you have some young people that are able to really commit and kind of want to kind of see it all the way through, then you can have a role for them. But then having sort of a role that allows some folks to kind of just jump into it and jump out of it without it derailing the whole process. So some scaled. And then just a few other thoughts. We just got to kind of having a conversation as a group through this process about incentives and benefits, right? So, they were paid honorariums, that we gave them food and transit tokens and all the usual sort of stuff. But it did get us thinking about, and we've been pushed recently in some more recent work we've been doing, and we have some great peer workers that have been kind of giving us some good insight. And I think one of the things is, I think as a group we can challenge ourselves to try to give slightly more concrete and more tangible benefits to folks. And so a lot of what we've been hearing is, the search for jobs and the search for kind of that next step is really important. And so giving them things that, trainings and certificates and things that really kind of are concrete in helping move that forward, I think is a good way to go. And then, also thinking through another thing that kind of came out of it is it can feel a little bit dissatisfying to kind of create this really great community, get this space going, put together this real kind of interesting project, and then after the 5 sessions you kind of all scatter to the wind and everyone goes their different directions. And so I think doing this again, we would probably give more thought to, and it was there, but I don't know if we sort of really formalized it, figuring out how to kind of bridge these young people through into new endeavors and new connections to kind of keep that relationship going and keep that momentum going. And so, Sean has some work kind of out there talking about this idea of thinking in terms of participatory action careers as opposed to projects, right? The single project doesn't really fit well with the participatory action kind of values in a lot of ways. It kind of works against it. So if we kind of broaden that out to think about, well, okay, how can we have participatory action careers where we're kind of slowly over time kind of bringing people into our work and building those kind of more long-term relationships and figuring out how to kind of keep it going, I think is really valuable. And I think that brings me to the end of my little spiel. Oh yeah, sorry, thank you for reminding me. So just as a kind of a bit of a plug for a new kind of project that we're doing. So with a new initiative, we were talking about it a bit yesterday, called Hop C. And our colleague Marty Daly, I see at the back. So Marty, with a lot of tremendous hard work, worked with a group of young people on our current project on a sort of a similar kind of knowledge translation, community building kind of endeavor. And it was this My Guide. And it's this really phenomenal book that is sort of a diary that young people kind of can engage with, and that really sort of has a lot of kind of mindfulness and self-care and really great tips. And so it was built through this really kind of complex process that I'm sure Marty would be happy to talk to you about. And so the project, the book, if you're at all interested in it for your organization, is available through Eva's initiative, through their print shop. And yeah, please come talk with us and we can kind of try to get your name and send something out. We've also dropped a few copies in the youth lounge just around the corner there too. Okay, are we good? All right.
All right. So I'm going to talk about the mums, just because I am a mom. I am a grandmother. So I want to look at knowledge mobilization from practice for practice change. And just as Sean and Tyler have said, we're very struck throughout this project that we can't just stop here. There's so much more that needs to be done. And just picking up on the first presentation that was made here this morning, I was hearing the presenter from Australia, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but how important it is that we make systemic change. The whole world needs to change, not individuals. We can't do siloed kinds of change, how important it is. So, so what we were looking at, and I'm sorry I can't read that over there. What we were looking at is trying to build an understanding of women who were living with or without addictions and their journeys off the street, the trauma experienced by these women and their triggers for change, which we thought were important. It was triggers for change, both the turning points and the tipping points. So they weren't all positive as their engagement in the building resilience. And characteristics of formal supports and resources identified by the mums and necessary to assist their journey toward recovery, which I think is important for us to look at what resources and supports, how do they need to be working, what sort of changes do they need to be making. So it was I think everybody's already talked about, it was a longitudinal study for 12 months, and we had 51 young people, and 13 were mothers, 9 were from Halifax, 4 from Toronto, and that is not really a reflection of our birthing rate in Nova Scotia at all. In case you're thinking, we're desperate for young people to come to Nova Scotia, so please come. But we had a number of young mums join us who were in supportive housing for young mums. So, and their journey was very informative for us. So the non-mother trajectories that we found, so the non-mothers, their journey off the streets was initially a burst of hope, and then an optimism, but then followed often by, as you've already heard, but the long and challenging path towards a meaningful life. And the common features were cycling in and out of homelessness. Often it was a demoralizing experience, very isolating and distressing for them. So that was the non-mothers. For the mothers, their trajectory had critical elements, obviously pregnancy. It was a trigger for change, but as I said, it wasn't always a positive trigger. Setting priorities and supports and services, and for moms with addictions, it was dealing with the addictions. So what were the triggers for change? So for the moms, pregnancy proved to be, a common trigger for change, but mothers encountered both the opportunities and the challenges unique to the role of parent. So it involved making a difficult decision about whether to keep the pregnancy. That was one thing. And then deciding for a turning point, taking action to exit the street life. And for other moms, being kicked out of the home and entering street life. So it was a tipping point. So not all moms had the same experience, and it was important for us to understand being pregnant had a number of turning point or triggers that we had to explore with them. The pregnancy was a turning point, and I will read the comments that the moms made because I think they're very powerful. I was bad. was worse like assault. The last time I was in jail, I was in for robbery, armed robbery, and home invasion. Change. But then I actually found out I was pregnant while I was in youth penitentiary. I was admitted until I was 6 months pregnant with my oldest child and got out, poof, she's 6 years old and haven't been in trouble since. So what changed? My baby did. She's my star. So look at what the pregnancy, although she wouldn't necessarily have asked to be pregnant, but she made it work for her. And moving from the jail out and saying, this is my kid. She's my star. I'm going to work with her. Here's another turning point. Pregnancy was one turning point, but keeping the baby was another. For some, pregnancy triggered reformed behavior, but having CIS remove a mother's 2 children before she recognized that her priorities were her children and not her partner. So for a number of moms, they reflected that this mom, her man was in jail, and she was saying, I'm putting all my priorities on him. What am I doing that for? He's a nobody. I'm a mom. It's my baby that's really the important one. So I lost my kids over him, and look at my choices by choosing him rather than my children. Pregnancy, a turning point for mothers with addictions. I had to go live in a shelter for about 3 to 4 months. They said I had to live in a shelter to keep the baby. I didn't like it very much because there was a lot of drug addicts there. And drug addicts, and because after I found out I was pregnant, I stopped, because I was doing everything, and I kind of smartened up a little bit, and then I just changed after that, because then I had no contact with nobody, and that was hard. So choosing to say goodbye to the drugs meant I was all alone. Now what am I going to do? So it's one decision. I'm not going to do the drugs. It's quite another thing. So what do I do now? I'm all alone. I'm isolated. Setting priorities, shifting the focus from someone or to someone who needs me. So for the moms, they're setting their priorities really shifted. A shift in focus from the self to the baby, someone to care about, particularly when mother had been abandoned. And she said, I'm not bouncing from place to place. I don't have to rely on other people. I couldn't be bouncing from or with my son, because if I just kept bouncing, then obviously they take him. So I need to be secure. And the supports and services that the mothers needed to feel safe and secure. So what happened? What was within the supports and services that helped them? A number of the moms were very fearful about the services. You can imagine a number of them were underage, so Children's Aid was very prominent in their thinking. And even if they were overage, they were still thinking, CAS is watching me. So fearful about whether and how to access services. I might think I need services. I might even know where I should get services, but I'm terrified to go because they'll be after me. I had bad trust issues, like a lot. So when I had my problems, I had to deal with them myself because I'm always scared of, like in that situation where I didn't know if I could get his milk or diapers or whatever, I would always get to the point where I'd be scared to ask anybody in case they'd call Children's Aid on me and something because I couldn't support the child. So I knew I need services. I was trying hard to get them, but I'm terrified to ask because they're probably going to take my kid because they're going to say I'm a bad mom. The negative experience is another one. After life on drugs, so my mother let me back in the home again for a little bit, but we were friends again. But then she found out that I was pregnant, and as soon as I found I was pregnant, 8 months in, she found out she was pregnant, I was mixed up in a lot of bad things, and that changed. And the police and Children's Aid came and kicked me out of the hospital a few days after I gave birth. just a couple of days after I gave birth. So that made everything a little bit harder, because then, plus I wasn't allowed to see my family. So my family, cut me off. So she was visited by the police and Children's Aid in the hospital, having just given birth, and kicked out of the hospital. Back to what the speaker said early this morning about where changes have to occur. How could we have her in the hospital and just kick her out? But many women had positive experiences, and I think it's really important that we look at them. Some women who were afraid of CAS, and even when enforcing painful legal regulations, some CAS workers used honest yet supportive approaches. An example, when needing to remove a child from an abusive father, a CAS worker focused not only on the child to help the mother acknowledge her harmful living arrangement. So what was really important, she gave the mother a choice, and this is what she said. Yeah, my CAS worker came in. Well, the boyfriend, was arrested that night for hitting me while holding my son, and he wasn't allowed back in the house. But the next day he came back anyway, and like I had a black eye and stuff, and he came back. His mom came with him. And then there was a knock at the door, and it was a CAS worker, and I opened the door, and she came in, and she said, you have two choices. You can either stay here, and I'll take your son, or pack your stuff, and we'll leave right now. Well, when it comes to my son, like, boyfriend will never win. My son will always come before anybody. So I left. So a beautiful experience of the CAS worker giving the mom the choice. She made the decision. It wasn't the CAS worker. And actually, it continued with that, watching that mom over the rest of our experience over the year. The mom and the CAS worker actually became very close, and the dad continued, and they both took parenting programs and continued to work with services until mom and the dad, got together, and the CAS workers celebrated their togetherness. So they were doing a beautiful job. So that took a long time. So some other positive changes, mom living with addictions. I was involved with CAS. I was hiding in the shelters when my baby was born. I didn't really leave, but then I had a meeting with a CAS. I got this new worker, and he came in, and he was like, I hear you're looking for places and stuff. Because my last CAS worker wasn't trying to help me. They were just wanting to take my baby. And so they were just telling me, just give her up, and you can go back to your life. And then he was like, well, I know this place. And he gave me the paper, and I read it, and it was like, this sounds perfect. And they finally let me in. So how a worker really worked with her according to what she was interested in, instead of just, we're going to take the baby. And here's another mom. I was trying to find a place not geared to addictions. I came across supportive housing. I called them because I really wanted to get out of the shelter, because it was not a good environment for me. I finally got into the program. I was there for, almost 2 years. So I stayed in that program. I had to do programs every day, but then I got my life back. I was allowed to see my family and stuff. The police and CAS finally left me alone. And then after that, I just found this place that I'm living in now. So reflections on what the year had been like for a number of the moms. We asked the moms, what had this experience been like over the year? And one mom, many mothers built resilience, and I think that this comment is a beautiful one. What I tell myself now is that I chose this life. My children are not planned, but I chose to keep them. I chose to raise them. So for me, I chose this. This is my responsibility for me to step up to the plate and be who they deserve. Wow. Pretty powerful stuff, I would say, in terms of resilience. So looking at the kind of some key observations that we noticed and that the moms talked about, what were the positive characteristics of support and services? Because we know there were some negative ones as well, but they identified what was really key to them. And so what they noticed was people who were honest, transparent, trustworthy, and fully engaged with me, not just coming to do X, Y, Z. They actually engaged with me, wanted to hear what was going on, wanted to assist. They provided physical and emotional safety, fostered a sense of belonging. They nurtured interest in moving forward and skill development. So just as Sean and Tyler had talked about, it's important. It's not just what happens over the next couple of days and to get some housing. It's where do I go from here? I really want to go to school, or I want a job, or I need some skills. How do I get those skills? I need the skills. We can't just move on without gaining some other skills. The importance of an advocate, how important an advocate is in our supports and services, and a navigator, someone to help me navigate from A to B, not just say, well, you should go to their services out there. How am I supposed to know which services to go to? I need help to know how to get there, how to choose them, what am I supposed to say, what am I not supposed to say. So these workers were the ones who made collaborative links with other resources and agencies and sectors and assisted with the transitions. Whoops. Yeah. So, thank you. I'll leave it at that. So just to say that while I focus really on the moms, I think that we saw some amazing resilience that was developed, and not all the moms had a positive experience, no question. Not all the moms had addictions, a number of them did. But to look at moms who had been through huge trauma, add on a pregnancy, add on I'm keeping the baby, all of that adds on huge workload, but these moms were using, the focus on my child is important. I don't want my child to ever say that I was a horrible mom, so how do I need to change? I think it helped to motivate an awful lot of the moms. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you. I think I may speak for about 5 minutes, just highlight the methods, and then open it up for questions, because it's always the most fun to kind of dialogue and discuss a lot of these findings. And methods sometimes seems a bit dry, but we were pretty wowed by this, because at the same time as all these interesting findings that the team has highlighted, there was also something else going on, and it was very symbolic to a lot of what we were finding in our kind of substantive analysis. And that was that our methods really highlighted this complexity and nuance of what we are doing with this particular population, and how we actually understood issues around representation, around power, around voice, and primarily around being authentic. So let me just, so what we kind of like, as we were exploring kind of the framework of building this longitudinal analysis, which is really unique. Like we didn't really have any guides to it. What we started to realize also was that the kind of ethics guides of the universities were not actual true guides, that we needed to kind of set something else up. We needed to kind of build maybe a more street-oriented, kind of a kind of an ethical dimension that allowed for the ambiguity and messiness of this style of work. We've talked about the method already. So we had a big team, and a lot of us, like as I said, have either been in the field as practitioners, academics. We have worked with this population for 20, 25 years. I just bumped in a few people who are at Coven House. I was at Coven House working about 28 years ago. So we had this built experience, but at the same time, we were really overwhelmed by what we found. The notion of what we were doing, kind of, we hadn't thought through in a way that honored and built a compassion for the populations we were working with. So we had this large team. A lot of us have a lot of experience. But then we start to realize that this type of methodology and this type of population has to allow for a different kind of style of methodological intervention. We actually started to frame our work not as a methodology, but as an intervention. And that's complicated because what we were trying to explore were trajectories. And there's always this notion, regardless of it's qualitative or quantitative, ours was mixed methods, this notion that there's kind of a bit of a neutral reportage, an objectivity to make it kind of a scientific analysis. And right from the start, a lot of us critiqued that as well, and I'm sure, you know, there's a lot of critique in the literature, and I'm sure most of you kind of explored those styles of debates and critiques. But what we had noticed right from the start was you couldn't do this type of research with this population. It was all of a sudden we were exploring trajectories, we were in those trajectories. We actually started to impact those trajectories. And that became kind of a really important finding of ours. Some of these quotes, I love this quote, you know, nobody involved in research in the social can avoid confronting all these kind of ethical dimensions. And here's a discussion that one of our interviewers is having with one of our participants. And all of a sudden we realize, wow, we are not simply collecting data here, but we are very much engaged in these dimensions. And by the way, like we could flip all these PowerPoints. You don't feel like you need to take photos. And this is also in our book, and we've written a lot about this. So in a way, I just wanted to capture that this stuff is messy and complicated. I like this idea of it's a nuanced entanglement. All of a sudden, we were having team meetings once every few weeks. We started to realize that, wow, we actually hadn't trained enough with our interviewers to actually understand what it means to be getting stories from participants, to be engaging in building deeper relationships. The fact that we were using texting for kind of the first time that we had realized to connect with participants kind of was really, really a shock for us, because all of a sudden we weren't simply meeting once a month to discuss stuff with folks. We actually were having discussions throughout the day, before the interviews, throughout the weeks prior to an interview, connecting with folks, getting information, sharing, and building deeper connections. In a way, we kind of we started to conceptualize our fieldwork as kind of edge work. We're constantly on this edge. In a way, building relationships. In a way, engaging in their trajectories, and also starting to share our own worlds. So our interviewers started to share a lot more of who they were with participants, and this kind of deeper sense of connection emerged. We also were very much aware of kind of the ethical messiness around providing funding for participants to be kind of sharing their stories. And we kind of conceptualized in a very different way that they were part of our research, and we actually talked to them about how they felt about being provided honorariums, and all of them kind of argued that in a way it was a connection to our work that they wanted to be, and they felt that that was a respectful way to be connected. Like I said earlier, we started to, this framed out as more of an intervention than a methodology. We started to become robustly connected to their worlds, and all of a sudden started to not only kind of accrue data, but also be sharing deeper and deeper about their worlds, and in many ways kind of starting to shape and inject into their trajectories. One of the also the kind of interesting pieces was this idea of kind of emotional work. We found that all the folks that we had hired to be part of our teams were starting to realize that there's an emotional labor that emerged, hearing people's stories, connecting, building relationships, starting to share their own worlds. The kind of distance between themselves and others, the connection throughout the interviews, and the deeper kind of dialoguing that emerged, all kind of created this kind of emotional analysis. A lot of times, a lot of our interviewers wanted to hang with us, to connect with us on weekly team meetings to discuss what they were going through and how they were feeling. And how we kind of ended, one of the big pieces that we were worried about was, how are we going to kind of close off this after a year of connection? So our last interview, we flipped to ask actually the young people involved in our research how they felt about this, what they wanted out of it. And it was really interesting to kind of see from their explorations what it meant to be part of this team for a year, what it meant to kind of be sharing their narratives. And in a way, they were highlighting also the power that they had in sharing the pieces to make up their own storylines. And for the majority, they felt it was a deeply therapeutic, cathartic kind of process of talking about their worlds with us. And kind of one of our, I think, core conclusions that even though we had this intimate knowledge of kind of the ethics process, and we were really worried more about retention, recruitment, our methods working, what we never realized were all these kind of more subtle, complicated dynamics of what happens when you are exploring trajectories and you become part of that trajectory. What happens when you deeply connected to a participant? How do you say goodbye? What does informed consent actually entail for a whole year? All those dynamics were stuff that ethics never asked us, and we hadn't really conceptualized until kind of muddling through this. And just like everything else, it seemed, in this research, it was those nuances and complexities that were actually more significant than the actual findings, per se. And just the last note is this idea that it rarely gets written up. Methods rarely get written up this way. So we had to be more authentic to our participants and honor the kind of complexity of this type of work, that we wrote our methods this way. So you'll see in the book and in various articles that have emerged, we speak to this. We speak to the fact that in many ways, these were things that we learned as we went. And ethics boards, university and hospital ethics boards really, I think, need to shift a little bit to understand this kind of this notion of kind of street ethics that we highlight. And that's our team. Thank you. I'm sure there's lots of questions around our work. So thank you for listening.
Kind of high-level view on it. A more specific question, actually, around the texting piece, because we have found like this is just a fantastic way to keep connected with participants who are otherwise, hard to keep connected with over time. So do you have any kind of more specifics on how you manage that? I don't know if your experience is like ours, but there were often kind of other questions and conversations that developed through text, and a sense of responsibility to not ignore those, and to not ignore those when they came through, but also then recognizing we're kind of going way beyond anything that our ethics board had presumed we would be doing in the work. So